when a desperate woman steals his horse and pleads, "Please don't take my life. I'm pregnant." Lonely Nebraska rancher Ezra Blackwood makes a split-second decision that will change both their fates forever. But when bounty hunters arrive claiming she's a wanted criminal who's never been pregnant at all, will the mercy he showed under the dust and stars prove to be his salvation or his doom? The gunshot echoed across the empty Nebraska plains like thunder on a clear day. Ezra Blackwood stood frozen, his rifle still smoking in the October wind of 1867. But he hadn't pulled the trigger. Somewhere in the distance, another shooter was out there, and they were close. Ezra dropped to one knee behind a stack of weathered fence posts, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 months alone on this God-forsaken homestead had made him jumpy, but this was different. This was real danger creeping across his land like a prairie fire. The wind carried the smell of dust and dying grass, but also something else that made his stomach turn: gunpowder, fresh and sharp in the air. His brother Samuel's grave sat 50 yards away, marked by a simple wooden cross that tilted in the constant wind. Samuel had always been the brave one, the one who'd convinced Ezra to leave their comfortable life in Ohio and chase dreams of gold and glory in the West. Now Samuel slept under 6 feet of Nebraska dirt, and Ezra was alone with nothing but regrets and a failing farm. Another shot cracked through the air, closer this time. Ezra gripped his rifle tighter and scanned the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and red that reminded him of blood. In the distance, he could see his small herd of cattle scattered and nervous, their heads raised and ears forward. Something had spooked them good. Movement caught his eye near the old barn, a shadow that didn't belong, darting between the broken boards and rusted farm equipment that Samuel had never gotten around to fixing. Ezra squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There, by the water trough, a figure hunched low, moving like a wounded animal. Ezra had learned to be careful during his months of solitude. The frontier was full of dangerous men outlaws, claim jumpers, Indians who didn't appreciate white settlers on their ancestral hunting grounds. A man who trusted too easily out here ended up like poor Samuel, coughing up blood and dying slow, while the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away. But something about this figure struck him as different. Smaller than he'd expect from a hardened criminal, moving wrong, like someone who was hurt or scared or both. Ezra crept forward, using the fence line for cover. His boots made soft sounds in the dirt, barely audible over the constant prairie wind. Step by step, he closed the distance between himself and the mysterious visitor. The figure was definitely human, not an animal, wearing dark clothes that had seen better days, a hat pulled low, shoulders hunched forward in a way that spoke of defeat rather than danger. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities. Could be a drifter looking for work, though most men would approach the house directly and call out a greeting. Could be someone running from the law, seeking a place to hide until the heat died down. Could be Worsey Scout for a larger group of bandits, checking to see what the lone rancher might be worth robbing. The smart thing would be to stay hidden, wait for the stranger to move on. But Ezra hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 months, and the loneliness had become a physical ache in his chest. Even a dangerous conversation might be better than the crushing silence that surrounded him day and night. He decided to take a risk. "You there," he called out, not quite pointing his rifle but keeping it ready. "What's your business on my land?" The figure froze like a deer caught in torchlight. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind whistled through gaps in the barn walls, creating an eerie song that made Ezra's skin crawl. Then the stranger began to turn around, hands raised slightly in a gesture that might have been surrender or might have been preparation to draw a hidden weapon. Ezra kept his distance but stepped into clearer view. I said, "What's your business here? This is private property." The voice that answered was soft, almost lost in the wind. I didn't mean no harm, mister." Something in that voice made Ezra pause. It carried a tremor he recognized, the sound of someone who had been running scared for too long. He'd heard it in his own voice during the worst nights after Samuel died, when the darkness pressed in and he wondered if he might be the next one to end up in a lonely grave. "Turn around slow," Ezra instructed. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The stranger complied, and Ezra felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a man at all, but a woman. Young, with dark hair escaping from beneath a worn hat, and eyes that held depths of exhaustion he'd never seen before. Her dress was torn in several places and stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. She held herself carefully, as if moving caused pain. One hand rested protectively over her stomach, in a gesture that made Ezra's heart skip a beat. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "You hurt?" She shook her head quickly, but the movement seemed to cost her. "No, sir. Just tired. Been walking for days." Ezra studied her face, noting the hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. When was the last time this woman had eaten a proper meal, or slept in a real bed? "Walking from where?" he asked. "East," she said vaguely, not meeting his eyes. "From back east." The answer told him nothing and everything at the same time. She was running from something, that much was clear. The question was whether she was running from danger or toward it. "You got a name?" Ezra kept his voice gentle, but his grip on the rifle remained firm. "Margaret," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Margaret Holloway." The pause before the last name made Ezra wonder if it was real or something she'd picked out of thin air. Not that he could blame her for being careful. A woman alone on the frontier had to be smarter than most men just to survive. "Well, Miss Holloway," Ezra said, "you picked a dangerous time to be wandering around. There's been shooting nearby. Might want to find yourself some shelter until whoever's doing the shooting moves on." Margaret's eyes widened with fear that seemed genuine. "Shooting? Here?" "Heard 2 shots in the last few minutes," Ezra confirmed. "Could be hunters. Could be trouble. Either way, it ain't safe to be out in the open." He watched her process this information, saw the way her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach again. The gesture tugged at something deep in his chest, a protective instinct he'd thought died with his brother. "Look," he said, making a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt right. "I got a cabin just over that ridge. Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof. You're welcome to rest there until morning. Get your strength back before you move on." Margaret stared at him as if he'd offered her the moon. You'd do that? For a stranger?" "Out here, we look after each other," Ezra said, though the words felt hollow. Who had looked after Samuel when the fever took hold? Who had looked after Ezra during the long, dark nights when grief threatened to swallow him whole? Maybe helping this lost woman was really about helping himself. "I don't have money to pay you," Margaret said quietly. "Didn't ask for any." Ezra slung his rifle over his shoulder in a gesture of trust that could get him killed if he'd misjudged her character. "Come on. Let's get you inside before whoever's doing that shooting decides to come calling." As they walked toward his cabin, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. The lonely rancher who'd spoken to no one but ghosts for 3 months was about to have company. A woman company, which brought complications he wasn't sure he was ready to handle. But Margaret Holloway, that was really her name, looked like she was carrying troubles that made his own seem small. And something about the way she held herself, the careful protection of whatever secret she carried, made him want to offer whatever safety his humble home could provide. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deeper shades of red. Somewhere in the distance, another gunshot echoed across the plains. And Ezra Blackwood, who had thought his story was ending in lonely failure, began to suspect it might just be beginning. Margaret stumbled as they climbed the small hill toward Ezra's cabin, and he reached out instinctively to steady her. The moment his hand touched her arm, she flinched away so violently that she nearly fell. "Sorry," she whispered, her face flushing red. I'm not used to." "It's all right," Ezra said quickly, pulling his hand back. "My mistake." But it wasn't all right, and they both knew it. The reaction told him more about Margaret Holloway's recent past than any words could have. Someone had hurt her, and hurt her bad. The cabin came into view as they crested the hill, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney that Samuel had built during their first optimistic summer. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the evening air, and warm light glowed in the single window. "It ain't much," Ezra said, feeling suddenly embarrassed about his humble home, "but it keeps the wind out most of the time." Margaret stopped walking and stared at the cabin as if she were seeing a palace. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice carried such longing that Ezra felt his heart twist. How long had it been since she'd seen anything that looked like home? He pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter first. Margaret hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting around as if memorizing every detail. The single room contained a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove that provided both heat and cooking, and shelves lined with Samuel's books. "Sit," Ezra said, indicating one of the chairs. "I'll get some coffee going." Margaret lowered herself carefully into the chair, and Ezra noticed how she kept her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. Every movement was calculated, controlled, like someone who'd learned that survival depended on always being ready to run. As he worked at the stove, measuring coffee grounds into a battered pot, Ezra found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. In the lamplight, he could see details that had been hidden outside the delicate bones of her face, the graceful curve of her neck, the way her dark hair caught golden highlights. She was beautiful, he realized, not the painted beauty of saloon girls or the soft beauty of protected Eastern ladies, but something deeper, a beauty carved by hardship and refined by suffering. "How long since you eaten?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Yesterday," Margaret said. "Maybe the day before. Time gets mixed up when you're walking." Ezra opened a can of beans and began heating them in a pan. "Walking from where exactly? You mentioned back east, but that covers a lot of ground." The silence stretched long enough that he thought she might not answer. When he turned to look, he found her staring at her hands, which were folded protectively over her stomach. "Kansas," she said finally. "Started in Kansas." "That's a long walk." Ezra tried to calculate the distance. "Must be close to 200 miles, depending on where in Kansas." 237, Margaret said, then seemed surprised that she'd been so specific. I kept track, helped pass the time." Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows. A pregnant woman walking nearly 240 miles alone? Either she was running from something truly terrible, or towards something desperately important. "What's in Kansas that's worth walking away from?" he asked gently. Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Nothing worth staying for, that's certain." The beans began to bubble in the pan, filling the cabin with a homey smell that reminded Ezra of better times. Before Samuel got sick, before the dreams of prosperity turned to dust, before the loneliness became so heavy he could barely carry it. "You married, Miss Holloway?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Margaret's hand moved to her stomach again, and Ezra saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Was my husband. He died. Cholera." "I'm sorry." And he was. Ezra knew the particular pain of losing someone you depended on. "When?" 2 weeks ago." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Maybe 3. Hard to remember exactly." Something about her answer bothered him, but Ezra couldn't put his finger on what. Maybe it was the way she said it, too rehearsed, like a story she'd told herself so many times she almost believed it. He served the beans and coffee, setting Margaret's portion in front of her with care. She stared at the food, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "You need to eat." Margaret picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a small, tentative bite, then another. Then she was eating with desperate hunger, trying to maintain dignity while clearly starving. Ezra ate his own meal slowly, watching her without being obvious about it. The more he observed, the more questions formed in his mind. Her clothes were well made, or had been ensenote, the rough garments of a poor farmer's wife. Her hands, despite being dirty and scraped from travel, showed signs of having been soft once, protected. And there was something about the way she held herself, a carefulness that spoke of recent injury. "Miss Holloway," he said when she'd finished eating, "I don't mean to pry, but are you hurt? You're moving like something pains you." Margaret's eyes flashed with something fear, anger. I'm fine, she said quickly. Just tired from walking. Because if you need a doctor. No! The word exploded from her with such force that Ezra leaned back in surprise. No doctors, please. They stared at each other across the small table, the lamplight flickering between them. In Margaret's eyes, Ezra saw a terror so deep it made his stomach clench. All right, he said softly. No doctors. Margaret seemed to realize how she'd sounded. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's just that doctors cost money I don't have. It was a reasonable explanation, but Ezra didn't believe it for a second. There was more to this story, layers of secrets wrapped around whatever truth had driven her to walk 200 miles alone. The baby, he said carefully. When's it due? Margaret's hand moved protectively to her stomach, and for a moment her whole face softened. Spring, she said. Early spring, I think. First child? The softness vanished, replaced by a pain so raw it took Ezra's breath away. Yes, she whispered. First child. Another lie, he was certain. Or maybe not a lie exactly, but not the whole truth either. Everything about Margaret Holloway was wrapped in shadows and half-truths, and Ezra found himself more curious than cautious. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending cold drafts through gaps in the walls. Margaret shivered and pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Storm coming, Ezra observed. Good thing you found shelter when you did. Good thing, Margaret agreed, but her eyes were distant, as if she were thinking about something else entirely. Where were you headed? Ezra asked, when you decided to borrow my horse. Margaret's cheeks flushed red. I wasn't. I was just. She stopped, took a deep breath, and looked him straight in the eye. I was going to take your horse. I'm sorry. I was desperate, and I saw it by the water, and I thought maybe you wouldn't miss it right away. The honesty surprised him. Most people would have kept lying, built elaborate stories to justify their actions. But Margaret had chosen truth, even when it made her look bad. Why my horse? He asked. Because I've been walking for weeks, and my feet are bleeding, and I'm so tired I can barely stand. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back too long. Because there's still so far to go, and winter's coming, and I'm scared I won't make it. Make it where? Margaret was quiet for so long that Ezra thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind. California. I heard there are opportunities there, for people who want to start over. California's a long way from Nebraska, Ezra said, especially for a woman traveling alone. I know. Margaret's voice was small, defeated. But I don't have anywhere else to go. The simple statement hit Ezra like a physical blow. He recognized the feeling, the crushing weight of having no choices, no options, no hope beyond the next sunrise. What about family, he asked. Surely you got people who'd help. Margaret shook her head. My parents died when I was 16. No brothers or sisters. My husband's family. She trailed off, and something dark flickered across her face. They wouldn't welcome me. There was a story there, Ezra could tell. Probably not a happy one. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. Margaret glanced toward the door with obvious anxiety. Storm will probably last all night, Ezra said. You're welcome to stay until it passes. I couldn't impose. You already ate my food and admitted to trying to steal my horse, Ezra pointed out with a slight smile. Might as well accept my hospitality too. For the first time since he'd met her, Margaret smiled back. It transformed her entire face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the woman she might have been under different circumstances. Thank you, she said simply. You're very kind. Not kind, Ezra corrected. Just lonely enough to appreciate the company. The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the glowing wood stove as if it were a miracle. When's the last time you slept in a real bed? Ezra asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. I can't remember. The admission broke something loose in Ezra's chest. This woman, this brave, desperate, secretive woman, had been carrying her burdens alone for too long, just like he had. Maybe they could help each other carry the weight. Take the bed, he said, standing up. I'll sleep on the floor by the fire." "Oh no, I couldn't." "Yes, you could, and you will." Ezra's voice carried a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "A pregnant woman needs proper rest." Margaret looked like she wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was clearly winning the battle. "Just for tonight," she said finally. "Just for tonight," Ezra agreed, though something in his chest hoped she might change her mind come morning. As Margaret settled onto the bed with obvious relief, Ezra banked the fire and spread blankets on the floor. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin felt warm and safe, more like home than it had since Samuel died. "Mr. Blackwood?" Margaret's voice was drowsy, already half asleep. "Yes, ma'am?" "Why did you help me? You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous." Ezra considered the question, listening to the rain and thinking about loneliness and second chances and the way Margaret's smile had chased shadows from her face. "Maybe," he said finally. "We're both exactly what the other one needs." But as he lay on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling and listening to Margaret's breathing slow into sleep, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that he still didn't know who she really was. And tomorrow might bring answers he wasn't prepared to hear. Margaret's scream shattered the morning silence like glass hitting stone. Ezra bolted upright from his makeshift bed on the floor, his heart hammering as he searched for the source of danger. She stood by the window, her face white as winter snow, pointing at something outside with a trembling finger. "There's someone out there," she whispered, "watching the house." Ezra grabbed his rifle and crept to the window, staying low. Through the gap in the curtain, he could see a lone figure on horseback, sitting motionless on the ridge, about 100 yards away. The morning mist made it hard to make out details, but the rider seemed to be studying the cabin with deliberate attention. "How long has he been there?" Ezra asked quietly. "I don't know. I just woke up and saw him." Margaret's voice shook. Do you think he followed me?" The question sent cold fingers down Ezra's spine. He'd assumed Margaret was running from personal troubles, bad marriage, family problems, maybe debts. But the terror in her voice suggested something far more dangerous. "Who would be following you?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer. She just kept staring at the rider, her hand pressed protectively over her stomach in that gesture that was becoming familiar. The rider suddenly wheeled his horse around and disappeared over the ridge, leaving nothing but morning mist and questions. "He's gone," Ezra said, but he kept the rifle ready. "For now." Margaret sank into a chair, her legs seeming to give out. "This is my fault. I've brought trouble to your door." "What kind of trouble?" Ezra sat across from her, studying her pale face. "Margaret, I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could afford to share. "My husband," she said finally. He wasn't a good man." "The one who died of cholera?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "There was no cholera. James is very much alive. At least, he was when I left Kansas." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Ezra felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, the flinching when he'd touched her arm, the terror of doctors, the way she moved like someone expecting a blow. "He hurt you," Ezra said. It wasn't a question. "Every day." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "For 2 years. And when I tried to leave," she touched her ribs gingerly, "he made sure I understood that wives don't leave their husbands. Not in his family." Ezra felt anger building in his chest, hot and righteous. He'd seen men who beat their wives before, had always despised them as cowards who picked on someone smaller and weaker. "So you ran?" "I took some money and ran." Margaret met his eyes defiantly. "Money I figured I'd earned through 2 years of bruises and broken bones. He probably considers it theft." "How much money?" Margaret hesitated. Enough to start over somewhere far away. Enough to make him very angry. That was when Ezra understood. The rider on the ridge wasn't some random drifter. He was a hunter, sent to track down a runaway wife and stolen money. "Does your husband have resources?" Ezra asked. "Money to hire men to come after you?" "His family owns 3 banks in Kansas." Margaret's voice was flat, defeated. "They have resources." Ezra felt the weight of what he'd gotten himself into settling on his shoulders. He'd offered shelter to a desperate woman, but he'd also made himself an enemy of people with real power. "I should go," Margaret said, starting to rise. "I won't bring more danger to your home." "Sit down." Ezra's voice carried a authority that surprised them both. "You're not going anywhere." "But where exactly would you go?" Ezra asked. "You're pregnant. You've got no horse, no supplies, and now you know there are men hunting you. You wouldn't make it 10 miles. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "Then what do you suggest?" Ezra looked around his simple cabin, thinking hard. One man with a rifle against professional hunters with money and resources wasn't good odds. But running wasn't an option either, not with Margaret in her condition. "We make this place defendable," he said finally, "and we hope whoever's tracking you decides you're not worth the trouble." Over the next several hours, they worked together to prepare the cabin for possible siege. Ezra moved his water barrels inside and checked his ammunition supply. Margaret, despite his protests that she should rest, helped by checking the windows for weak spots and organizing supplies. As they worked, she began to share more of her story in small pieces, like someone testing the water before diving in. "James seemed wonderful when we first met," she said while helping Ezra nail boards over a window that faced the ridge. "Charming, attentive, generous. My parents had just died, and I was so lonely." "When did it change?" Ezra asked. "Our wedding night." Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ezra could hear the pain underneath. "He said I belonged to him now, and I needed to understand what that meant." Ezra's jaw tightened, but he kept working. Getting angry wouldn't help Margaret now. "The money you took," he said. "Where did you get it?" "James kept cash in a safe in his study. I knew the combination, because I'd seen him open it." Margaret tested the strength of a board they'd just nailed in place. "I figured 2 years of being his punching bag was worth something. How much did you take?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Ezra thought she wouldn't answer. $500, she said finally. Ezra nearly dropped his hammer. $500 was more money than most people saw in 5 years. No wonder her husband's family was willing to hire hunters. "That's a lot of money," he said carefully. "It's not about the money." Margaret's voice turned hard. "It's about ownership. James doesn't care about $500. But he cares about people knowing that his wife ran away and stole from him. It makes him look weak. And weak men do dangerous things to prove they're strong," Ezra finished. "Exactly." They worked in companionable silence for a while, securing the cabin as best they could. But Ezra's mind was racing, trying to figure out their options. The smart thing would be to turn Margaret over to whoever came looking for her. It wasn't his fight, and he had his own survival to worry about. But every time he looked at her, saw the careful way she moved, the haunted look in her eyes, the protective gesture over her stomach, he knew he couldn't do it. "Margaret," he said as they took a break for lunch, "about the baby." She froze with a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. "What about it? Is it his?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Margaret set down her food and stared at her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "It's James's child." "Does he know?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Oh, he knows. He was very pleased about it, actually. Said it would keep me from getting any foolish ideas about leaving." Ezra felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. A pregnant wife would be even more trapped, more dependent, less likely to run. But Margaret had run anyway, which meant her desperation had been stronger than her fear. "What happened to make you finally leave?" he asked gently. Margaret was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean forward to hear. "He pushed me down the stairs," she said, "when I was 6 months along. Said I was getting too uppity, needed to remember my place." Ezra's blood turned to ice. "The baby?" "I lost it." Margaret's voice was flat, emotionless. "Bled for 3 days. Nearly died." "Jesus," Ezra breathed. "James was angry about losing his heir," Margaret continued. "Said it was my fault for being clumsy. But I think part of him was glad. It meant he could start over, make sure the next baby was born to a properly trained wife." Ezra stared at her, trying to process the horror of what she'd lived through. A man who would push his pregnant wife downstairs was capable of anything. "So when you tell people you're pregnant now," he began, It's a lie, Margaret finished. A lie that's kept me alive more times than I can count. Men hesitate when they think they might be hurting an unborn child. It gives me time to run. The admission hit Ezra like a physical blow. Everything he'd assumed about Margaret, every protective instinct she'd triggered, had been based on a lie. But looking at her now, seeing the shame and defiance warring in her face, he realized it didn't matter. She'd been hurt by someone who should have protected her. She'd lost a child to a man's cruelty. She'd walked 200 miles alone, telling whatever lies she needed to tell to survive. And she was still surviving, which took more courage than most people possessed. "Why did you tell me the truth?" he asked. Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked completely unguarded. "Because you've been kind to me without expecting anything in return. Because you've given me shelter and food and safety, and I was tired of lying to the first decent person I've met in years. And because you're scared that whoever's tracking you might tell me anyway," Ezra added. Margaret nodded. "That too." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared secrets settling between them. Outside, the wind was picking up again, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "Storm coming," Ezra observed. "Seems like there's always a storm coming," Margaret replied. That evening, as they prepared for another night of uncertain safety, Ezra found himself studying Margaret with new eyes. The woman who tried to steal his horse was more complex than he'd imagined, part victim, part survivor, part something else entirely. She'd lied to him about the pregnancy, yes, but she'd also trusted him with the truth about her husband, her escape, the money she'd taken. That trust felt like something precious, something he didn't want to break. "Margaret," he said as she settled onto the bed, "I want you to know that what you told me today, it doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it?" she asked. "You're still welcome here," Ezra said firmly, "for as long as you need." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Even though I lied?" "Everyone's got secrets," Ezra said, "and everyone deserves a chance to start over." As he banked the fire and prepared his bedroll on the floor, Ezra wondered what tomorrow would bring. The rider on the ridge had been a warning. He was sure of it. Soon, Margaret's past would catch up with them, and he'd have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect a woman who'd become more important to him than he cared to admit. But tonight, with the storm building outside and Margaret safe in his bed, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. He had someone to protect again, someone who needed him. And maybe, just maybe, someone who might need him as much as he needed her. The riders came with the dawn, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard ground like thunder that wouldn't stop. Ezra counted 5 men through the gap in the boarded window, all wearing dark coats and carrying rifles like they knew how to use them. "Margaret," he whispered urgently, "wake up, they're here." She came awake instantly, like someone who'd learned to sleep with one ear open. Her face went white when she saw the riders forming a line in front of the cabin. "Is one of them your husband?" Ezra asked, checking his rifle. Margaret crept to the window and peered out carefully. "No," she said after a moment, "but I recognize the man in front. His name is Coleman. He works for James's family." "What kind of work?" Margaret's voice was grim, the kind that doesn't get talked about in polite company. A voice called out from outside, strong and commanding. "Mrs. Holloway, we know you're in there. Come out now, and nobody gets hurt." Margaret flinched at the name, but she didn't move toward the door. "That's Coleman," she whispered. "He's the one who brought me back the first time I tried to leave." "First time?" Ezra looked at her sharply. "I tried once before, about a year ago. Made it almost to the Colorado border before they caught me." Margaret's hand moved unconsciously to her ribs. "James made sure I understood what happened to wives who embarrass their husbands." The voice outside called again. "We're not unreasonable people, Mrs. Holloway. Your husband just wants his property back. You return what you took, and we can all go home peaceful like." "Property," Margaret said bitterly. "He still thinks of me as property." Ezra studied the men through the window. They were spread out in a careful line, positioned so they could cover all sides of the cabin. These weren't amateur bounty hunters or drifters looking for easy money. They were professionals. "How many times has Coleman done this kind of work?" Ezra asked. I don't know, but I heard James's father talking once about how Coleman was worth his weight in gold for handling delicate family matters. And you're sure your husband isn't out there? Margaret shook her head. James wouldn't dirty his hands with this. He'll be back in Kansas, telling everyone I ran off with some drifter and that he's heartbroken about it. Mrs. Holloway, Coleman's voice was getting impatient. I'm going to count to 10. Then my boys and I are coming in to get you. It'll go easier if you just walk out now. Ezra felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 5 against 1 weren't good odds, especially when the 5 were experienced gunmen. 1! Coleman's voice rang out. I have to go, Margaret said, starting toward the door. I won't let you die for me. 2! Ezra caught her arm. Wait. 3. What are you thinking? Margaret asked desperately. 4. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities. The cabin was well built, but it wouldn't stand up to determined men with rifles. Running wasn't an option with Margaret on foot. Fighting seemed like suicide. 5. But maybe there was another way. 6. Listen to me, Ezra said quickly. When I open that door, you stay behind me and don't say a word unless I tell you to. 7. What are you planning? Margaret's eyes were wide with fear. 8. Trust me, Ezra said, and opened the door. 9. Hold on there, Coleman, Ezra called out, stepping onto the porch with his rifle held casually in his hands. No need for counting. Let's talk like civilized men. Coleman was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a carefully trimmed beard. He sat his horse like someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and his hand rested easily on his gun butt. You must be the rancher, Coleman said. Name's Coleman. I work for the Holloway family back in Kansas. Ezra Blackwood, Ezra replied. And I hear you're looking for Mrs. Holloway. That's right. She's wanted for theft, took $500 from her husband, and ran off. Coleman's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. We're here to take her home. Well now, Ezra said slowly, that's interesting, because the lady I'm harboring told me her husband died of cholera, said she was a widow. Coleman's smile was cold as winter wind. The lady you're harboring is a liar and a thief. She's also married to James Holloway, who's very much alive and very eager to see his wife again. Is that so? Ezra kept his voice conversational, but his grip on the rifle tightened slightly. And what makes you so sure the woman in my cabin is this Mrs. Holloway you're looking for? Coleman's eyes narrowed. Because we tracked her here. Because she matches the description perfectly. And because we know she's been telling people she's pregnant to gain sympathy. Behind him, Ezra heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. Pregnant, Ezra said, injecting just the right amount of surprise into his voice. Well, that's a problem, isn't it? How so? Coleman asked. Because the woman in my cabin isn't pregnant, Ezra said calmly. Fact is, she gave birth about a week ago. Delivered the baby myself. The lie rolled off his tongue, smooth as butter, and Ezra saw Coleman's certainty waver slightly. You delivered a baby? One of Coleman's men asked skeptically. My brother was a doctor before he died, Ezra said, which was almost true. Samuel had studied medicine for 2 years before deciding to become a farmer. Picked up some knowledge along the way. Good thing too, because the lady was in hard labor when she showed up at my door. Coleman was studying Ezra's face intently, looking for signs of deception. Where's the baby now? Died, Ezra said flatly. Came too early. Didn't make it through the first night. Buried it yesterday behind the cabin. The silence stretched taut as a wire fence. Ezra could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, but he kept his expression neutral. That's convenient, Coleman said finally. Convenient? Ezra let anger creep into his voice. You think it's convenient that a woman lost her child? That I had to dig a grave for a baby that never drew a proper breath? I think it's convenient that you've got an answer for everything, Coleman replied. And I think you're lying. Think what you want, Ezra said. But I know what I saw. And what I saw was a woman who'd walked herself nearly to death carrying a baby that wasn't meant for this world. Coleman seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, he dismounted and took a step toward the porch. I'd like to see this woman for myself, he said. Confirm she's not who we're looking for. She's grieving and exhausted, Ezra said. Last thing she needs is strange men bothering her. Won't take but a minute, Coleman insisted. Just need to see her face. Confirm she's not Margaret Holloway. Ezra felt sweat trickling down his back. This was the moment of truth, the point where his bluff would either work or get them both killed. Margaret, he called over his shoulder, there's some gentlemen here who think you might be someone else. Would you mind stepping out for just a moment? Margaret appeared in the doorway, and Ezra felt his breath catch. She'd somehow transformed herself. Her hair was loose and unkempt, her dress wrinkled and stained, her face pale and hollow-eyed. She looked exactly like a woman who'd recently given birth and lost her child. Gentlemen, she said in a voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for my appearance. It's been a difficult time. Coleman studied her face intently, and Ezra could see him comparing what he saw to whatever description he'd been given. Ma'am, Coleman said carefully, I need to ask you some questions. Margaret nodded slightly but didn't speak. What's your name? Margaret, she whispered. Margaret Brown. Where are you from? Colorado Territory. My husband and I had a small farm there. Your husband's name? William, Margaret said without hesitation. William Brown. He died of a fever last month. Coleman asked several more questions about her family, her journey, her husband's death. Margaret answered each one in a voice so soft and broken that even Ezra almost believed her story. Finally, Coleman seemed satisfied. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, he said, though his voice held no warmth, and I apologize for disturbing you during your time of grief. Margaret just nodded and retreated back into the cabin. Coleman remounted his horse and gathered his reins. Much obliged for your time, Mr. Blackwood. If you do happen to encounter Margaret Holloway, there's a substantial reward for information leading to her return. I'll keep that in mind, Ezra said. As the riders prepared to leave, Coleman paused and looked back at the cabin. Mighty strange coincidence, he said. 2 women named Margaret, both recently widowed, both traveling alone. It's a common name, Ezra replied. Indeed it is. Coleman touched his hat brim in a mocking salute. Good day to you, Mr. Blackwood. Ezra watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then went back inside, where he found Margaret sitting on the bed, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. Is he gone? She whispered. For now. Ezra sat beside her, careful not to get too close. But he's not convinced. He'll be back. How did you know to lie about the baby? Margaret asked. Because a woman who just lost a child looks different from a woman who's running from her husband, Ezra said. Grief changes people in ways that are hard to fake, but you managed it. Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. You risked your life for me. Why? Ezra considered the question, thinking about loneliness and second chances and the way Margaret's courage had impressed him even when she was lying to him. Because everyone deserves someone willing to stand up for them, he said finally. Even liars and thieves? Especially liars and thieves, Ezra said. Sometimes those are the people who need help the most. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand the first time she'd voluntarily touched him since they'd met. Thank you, she said simply. But even as Ezra felt the warmth of her hand in his, he knew their troubles were far from over. Coleman had been suspicious, and suspicious men didn't give up easily. The hunters would be back, and next time, they'd be ready for lies. The fire that consumed Ezra's barn lit up the night sky like a second sun, and he knew Coleman had returned with a message written in flames and smoke. They're trying to draw us out, Margaret whispered from behind the cabin's thick walls, her face orange in the flickering light that danced through their barricaded windows. Ezra gripped his rifle tighter, watching dark shapes move beyond the fire's glow. 3 days had passed since Coleman's first visit. 3 days of waiting and watching and knowing the hunters would return. Now they had, and they weren't interested in talking anymore. How many do you count? Margaret asked, her voice steadier than he'd expected. At least 6, Ezra replied, squinting through a gap in the boards they'd nailed over the windows. Maybe more. Hard to tell with all that smoke. The barn had been Samuel's pride-solid timber construction, that had taken them 2 months to build during their first summer in Nebraska. Now it was feeding a fire that would be visible for miles, announcing to anyone watching that something important was happening at the Blackwood homestead. A voice called out through the crackling flames, different from Coleman's but carrying the same cold authority. "Blackwood, we know the woman's in there with you. Send her out and we'll let you live." Margaret moved closer to the window, trying to see the speaker. "That's not Coleman," she said. "No, it's someone else." Ezra felt ice forming in his stomach. Someone Coleman brought in when he decided talking wasn't working. The new voice continued, rich with false friendliness. "Name's Fletcher, Mr. Blackwood. I work for people who don't like to be disappointed. Mrs. Holloway's husband is very disappointed that his wife hasn't come home yet." Margaret's face went pale at the name. "Fletcher," she breathed. "Dear God, they brought Fletcher. You know him? He's the one who found me the first time I ran." Margaret's voice shook with old terror. "He's the one who brought me back to James." Through the gap in the boards, Ezra could see a tall figure silhouetted against the burning barn. The man stood with casual confidence, as if burning buildings and threatening armed homesteaders was just another day's work. "What did he do to you?" Ezra asked quietly. Margaret was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He was very creative about teaching me the cost of running away." Ezra felt anger burning hotter than the fire outside. "What kind of creative?" "The kind that leaves scars you can't see," Margaret whispered. Fletcher's voice cut through the night again. "I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Blackwood. I understand why you might want to protect a lady in distress. But this particular lady belongs to someone else, and her owner wants her back." "Owner," Margaret spat. "Like I'm a horse or a piece of furniture. To them you are," Ezra said grimly. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" The barn's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. In the sudden flare of light, Ezra counted 8 men positioned around the cabin in a rough circle. Professional fighters, every one of them, armed and ready for a siege. "We can't fight 8 men," Margaret said, reading his thoughts. "Maybe we can't," Ezra agreed, "but we sure can't surrender. Not to Fletcher." A new sound reached them through the crackle of flames horses approaching from the east. Ezra's heart sank, thinking Fletcher had brought even more men. But as the riders came into view, he realized something was different. "Those aren't more hunters," he said, squinting into the darkness. Margaret peered through another gap in the boards. "Then who are they?" The answer came in the form of a familiar voice, calling out through the night. "Fletcher, what in blazes do you think you're doing on my land?" Ezra felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly knocked him over. "That's Sheriff Morrison from town. You know him?" "He helped me bury Samuel," Ezra said. "Good man. Fair man." Through the windows, they watched as Sheriff Morrison and 3 deputies rode into the circle of firelight. Morrison was a big man with iron-gray hair and a reputation for not tolerating troublemakers in his territory. "Sheriff," Fletcher called out with smooth politeness, "this is a private matter, family business." "Private matter?" Morrison's voice carried across the yard like thunder. "You burned down a man's barn and surrounded his house with armed men. That's not private. That's criminal." Fletcher stepped forward, his hands held peacefully at his sides. "We're here on behalf of James Holloway of Kansas. His wife was kidnapped by this rancher, and we're here to retrieve her." "Kidnapped?" Morrison's laugh was harsh. "That's not what I heard. Word around town is that a lady sought shelter here after her husband died, and you boys are trying to collect some kind of bounty." Ezra felt Margaret tense beside him. The story they'd told Coleman about being a widow from Colorado had spread, just as they'd hoped it would. "Sheriff," Fletcher said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I have legal papers here authorizing the return of stolen property." "Property?" Morrison's voice went dangerously quiet. "You calling a woman property?" "The law says a wife belongs to her husband," Fletcher replied. "And this wife stole $500 when she ran off." Morrison dismounted, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Even if that's true, which I doubt, you can't just ride into my county and start burning buildings. There are legal ways to handle these things." "We tried the legal ways," Fletcher said. The rancher lied to us, claimed the woman wasn't who we were looking for. Maybe she isn't, Morrison suggested. Fletcher's laugh was cold as winter wind. Oh, she is. We've done our research since our last visit. Margaret Holloway, age 22, dark hair, green eyes, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, ran away from her husband 3 weeks ago with $500 in stolen money. Margaret grabbed Ezra's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. The description was too accurate to deny. And you think burning down an innocent man's barn will make her more likely to come out? Morrison asked. I think it will make the rancher more likely to stop protecting her, Fletcher replied. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, studying the burning remains of the barn and the armed men positioned around the cabin. Finally, he called out toward the house. Ezra, you in there? I'm here, Sheriff, Ezra called back. You got a woman with you? Ezra hesitated, knowing that his next words would determine everything. I do. She there of her own free will? Another pause. She is. You hear that, Fletcher? Morrison's voice carried satisfaction. Ladies here of her own choice. That makes this harassment, not law enforcement. Fletcher's control finally cracked. Sheriff, that woman is a thief and a runaway wife. The law requires you to follow proper procedures. Morrison cut him off. File a complaint, get a warrant, work through the courts. You can't just ride in here like some kind of vigilante army. We have authorization from... You got authorization from Kansas, Morrison said firmly. This is Nebraska. My jurisdiction. My rules. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ezra could see Fletcher weighing his options, probably wondering if he could take on the sheriff and his deputies, along with whatever resistance came from the cabin. Sheriff, Fletcher said finally, his voice carefully controlled, I'd like to speak with the woman myself. Confirm her identity. No, Morrison replied flatly. No. You burned down her host's barn and surrounded his house with armed men, Morrison said. Far as I'm concerned, you've lost any right to a polite conversation. Margaret was trembling beside Ezra, whether from fear or relief he couldn't tell. The intervention of the law had shifted the balance, but Fletcher didn't look like a man who gave up easily. This isn't over, Fletcher called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Yes, it is, Morrison replied. For tonight, anyway. You and your boys are going to ride out of my county. Now. And if we refuse? Morrison's hand moved to his gun. Then you'll be under arrest for arson, trespassing, and disturbing the peace. Your choice. The standoff stretched for long minutes, firelight dancing on grim faces and ready weapons. Finally, Fletcher nodded to his men. We're leaving, he announced, but we'll be back with proper paperwork. When you come back, you come through me, Morrison said, and you come legal, or you don't come at all. As Fletcher and his men mounted their horses and rode away into the darkness, Ezra felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but not all of it. Fletcher wasn't the type to give up, and next time he'd be better prepared. Sheriff Morrison approached the cabin, his deputies staying back to give him room. Ezra, he called. It's safe to come out now. Ezra opened the door cautiously, his rifle still in his hands. Morrison stood in the yard, his weathered face grave in the dying firelight. Sheriff, Ezra said, much obliged for the help. Those boys were way out of line, Morrison replied. No call for burning a man's property, no matter what they think he's done. About the woman, Ezra began. Morrison held up a hand. Don't want to know the details, Ezra. What I do know is that lady sought shelter at your place, and she's staying of her own free will. That's enough for me. Fletcher said he'd be back with paperwork. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, Morrison said. But if he does come back, he'll do it legal or not at all. As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Ezra stood in his yard, watching the last flames consume what remained of his barn. Beside him, Margaret emerged from the cabin, her face pale but determined. They'll be back, she said quietly. I know, Ezra replied, and next time, they'll have legal authority. Maybe. Margaret looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the dying flames. Why are you doing this? Why are you protecting me? Ezra considered the question, thinking about loneliness and courage and the way Margaret had trusted him with her truth. "Because sometimes a person's got to make a stand," he said finally, "and this feels like the right place to make mine." But even as he said it, Ezra knew the real battle was still coming. Margaret's confession came at dawn, her words falling like stones into the quiet morning air. "There's something else I haven't told you about the money." Ezra looked up from where he was shoveling ash from the burned barn, his hands already black with soot. The ruins smoked in the pale light, sending thin gray streams toward a sky that promised rain. "What about it?" he asked, though something in her voice made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just sitting in James's safe. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, even though the morning wasn't cold. It was payment for something, something terrible. Ezra set down his shovel and gave her his full attention. After everything they'd been through, he'd thought there were no more secrets between them. What kind of payment? Margaret stared at the ground, unable to meet his eyes. There was a girl, Sarah. She worked in the kitchen at James's house. 16 years old, sweet as pie, sent money home to her sick mother every month. A chill ran down Ezra's spine. He'd heard stories like this before, and they never ended well. James noticed her, Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Started finding excuses to be alone with her. She tried to avoid him, but where could she go? He owned the house, paid her wages, controlled her whole life. "And you knew about this?" "I suspected. Then I caught him." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Coming out of her room one night, adjusting his clothes, smiling like he'd just won a prize. Ezra felt sick. "What did you do?" "I confronted him, told him to leave the girl alone." Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "He laughed at me, said Sarah was part of his property, just like I was. Said he could do whatever he wanted with what belonged to him. And Sarah got pregnant. James was furious, said she'd done it on purpose to trap him, so he gave her $50 and told her to take care of the problem." Margaret's voice broke. "She was so scared, Ezra. Just a child herself, and she was terrified." Ezra began to understand. "The money you took was the same money. $50 he paid to get rid of his own child, and $450 more he was planning to use to buy silence from Sarah's family." Margaret finally looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I took it all. Every penny. Figured if he could buy and sell people, someone ought to make him pay for it." The revelation hit Ezra like a physical blow. Margaret hadn't just stolen money from her husband, she'd taken blood money, payment for things that would haunt any decent person's dreams. What happened to Sarah? She tried to get rid of the baby with some back alley doctor. Nearly bled to death. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I found her and got her to a real doctor. Paid him with some of the money I'd taken, but it was too late to save the baby." "Is she alive?" "Barely. Last I heard, she was back home with her mother, trying to pretend none of it ever happened." Margaret's voice hardened. While James told everyone she was a loose girl who tried to seduce him and got what she deserved, Ezra stared at the smoking ruins of his barn, trying to process what he'd just heard. The woman he'd been protecting wasn't just running from an abusive husband, she was carrying evidence of crimes that could destroy a powerful man's reputation. "Does Fletcher know about Sarah?" he asked. "I don't think so. James wouldn't want that story getting out, even to his hired men." Margaret sat down heavily on a pile of lumber that had once been part of the barn wall. "But if they take me back, I'll disappear, and Sarah will never get justice." "Is that why you really ran? For Sarah?" Margaret nodded slowly. "James could beat me, humiliate me, treat me like property. I could live with that, or thought I could. But when I saw what he did to that innocent girl," she trailed off, staring at her hands, "I couldn't be part of it anymore. Couldn't pretend I didn't know." Ezra felt a new respect for the woman sitting among the ashes of his barn. She hadn't just run from her own suffering, she'd risked everything to strike back at a man who hurt defenseless people. "You could have told me this before," he said gently. "Would it have changed anything?" Ezra considered the question. "Maybe. Might have helped me understand why you were so scared." "I was scared you'd think I was a thief and a troublemaker," Margaret said. "Scared you'd decide I wasn't worth protecting. And now—" Margaret met his eyes, and he saw fear there, but also determination. Now I think you deserve to know the truth before you decide whether to keep helping me." Before Ezra could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them across the prairie, both of them tensed, expecting Fletcher's return. But the riders who appeared over the ridge were different, a small group, led by a man in an expensive coat and hat. "That's not Fletcher," Margaret said, squinting at the approaching figures. "No," Ezra agreed, reaching for his rifle, "but it's not good news either." The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of soft look that came from years of easy living. Behind him rode two younger men who could have been his sons, and a woman in traveling clothes who sat her horse with obvious discomfort. As they drew closer, Margaret's face went white as fresh snow. "Oh God," she whispered. "That's James's father, Mr. Holloway himself." Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. If the family patriarch had come all the way from Kansas, this was more serious than he'd imagined. The riders stopped about 20 yards away, well out of rifle range, but close enough to talk. Mr. Holloway dismounted with the careful movements of a man who wasn't used to long rides. "Mr. Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of money and power. "I'm Charles Holloway. I believe you're harboring my daughter-in-law." "Don't know anyone by that name," Ezra replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, let's not play games." Holloway's tone was reasonable, even friendly. "I've come a long way to resolve this situation peacefully." "What situation would that be?" "My son's wife took something that belongs to our family and ran away. We simply want her to come home where she belongs." Beside him, Margaret made a small sound of distress. Ezra could see her trembling, whether from anger or fear he couldn't tell. "And if she doesn't want to come home?" Ezra asked. Holloway's smile was cold as January wind. "Women don't always know what's best for them, Mr. Blackwood. Sometimes men have to make decisions for them." "That's an interesting philosophy," Ezra said carefully. "It's a practical one." Holloway took a step closer. "I'm prepared to be generous, Mr. Blackwood. Return my daughter-in-law to us, and I'll pay you $1,000 for your trouble. That's more money than most men see in 10 years. $1,000. Ezra felt the weight of the offer settling on his shoulders. It was enough money to rebuild his barn, buy new livestock, maybe even start over somewhere else if he wanted to. "That's a lot of money," he said slowly. "It is indeed." Holloway's smile widened. "All you have to do is stop protecting a woman who isn't your responsibility." Margaret stood up from the lumber pile, her face set with grim determination. "Hello, Father Holloway," she called out. The old man's expression shifted when he saw her, becoming almost paternal. "Margaret, my dear, you've caused us all such worry." "Have I?" Margaret's voice was steady, stronger than Ezra had ever heard it. "I'm sorry to hear that. Come home, child. James is beside himself with grief. He just wants his wife back." "His wife," Margaret repeated. "Not his property?" Holloway's mask slipped slightly. "Marriage makes a woman part of her husband's family, Margaret. You know that." "And what about the money James used to buy silence about Sarah Miller?" Margaret asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The change in Holloway was immediate and frightening. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Don't you?" Margaret stepped forward, no longer hiding behind Ezra. $50 to get rid of an inconvenient pregnancy, and $450 more to keep her family quiet about who the father was? One of the younger men, probably James himself, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The woman riding with them looked shocked, as if she was hearing this story for the first time. "You're speaking nonsense," Holloway said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Am I? Then why don't we ride into town and tell Sheriff Morrison the whole story?" Margaret's voice rang across the prairie like a bell. "I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about what your son did to a 16-year-old girl." The silence stretched taut as a wire fence. Ezra could see Holloway weighing his options, probably wondering how much Margaret actually knew and how much she could prove. Finally, the old man smiled again, but this time it held no warmth at all. "You're obviously unwell, Margaret," he said, "saying things that make no sense. That's why you need to come home where we can take care of you." I'm not going anywhere, Margaret said firmly. Holloway's eyes shifted to Ezra. Mr. Blackwood, surely you can see that this woman is disturbed. She's making wild accusations, stealing money, causing nothing but trouble. The generous thing would be to let her family handle her care. Ezra looked at Margaret, standing straight and strong despite everything she'd endured. Then he looked at Holloway, with his expensive clothes and cold eyes and the kind of power that crushed people like Sarah Miller without a second thought. I reckon she can speak for herself, Ezra said finally. Holloway's friendly mask finally cracked completely. This is your last chance, Mr. Blackwood. Take the money and walk away. And if I don't, then you'll discover that my family has a long reach and a longer memory. The threat hung in the air like smoke from the burned barn. Ezra felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulder saw $1,000 in safety or poverty and danger. But when he looked at Margaret, saw the hope and fear warring in her green eyes, he knew there was really no choice at all. I reckon I'll take my chances, he said. The telegram that arrived at Sheriff Morrison's office changed everything, and Margaret knew it the moment she saw his face when he rode up to the cabin that afternoon. Ezra, the sheriff called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man carrying bad news. We need to talk. Margaret felt her stomach drop as she watched Morrison approach the porch where she and Ezra sat mending harnesses. 3 days had passed since the Holloways' visit, 3 days of nervous waiting for the next move in a game that seemed to have no good endings. What's the word from town, Sheriff? Ezra asked, setting down his leather work. Morrison pulled a yellow piece of paper from his coat pocket. Got a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office. Says here that Margaret Holloway is wanted for grand theft in Kansas. $500 stolen from her lawful husband. Margaret's hands went cold despite the warm afternoon sun. That's not the whole story, she said quietly. Maybe not, Morrison agreed. But it's the legal story, and legal stories are what I have to deal with. Ezra stood up slowly, his face grim. What does that mean for us? Means I got to serve a warrant for Mrs. Holloway's arrest, Morrison said, pulling out a second paper. Kansas wants her back to face charges. And if she doesn't want to go? Ezra asked. Morrison's weathered face showed genuine regret. Then I got to take her anyway. Law's the law, Ezra. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. After everything they'd been through, after all of Ezra's protection and Sheriff Morrison's earlier support, it was coming down to a piece of paper with official seals. Sheriff, she said, standing up to face him directly, what if I told you that money was used to hurt an innocent girl, that it was payment for terrible things? I'd say that's something for a judge to decide, Morrison replied. Not me. But you know it's true, don't you? Margaret pressed. You've seen men like James Holloway before. You know what they're capable of. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. What I know, and what I can prove in court, are two different things, ma'am. So, you're just going to hand me over to them? I'm going to follow the law, Morrison said firmly. But the law says I got to transport you to Kansas for trial. Doesn't say I got to hand you over to your husband's family. Margaret felt a tiny spark of hope. What's the difference? The difference is that I'll be the one making sure you get to court alive and in one piece, Morrison said. And I'll be the one making sure your story gets told to a judge. Ezra stepped forward. When do you have to take her? Tomorrow morning, Morrison said. Sorry, Ezra. I waited as long as I could, hoping something would change. Something still could, Margaret said suddenly. Both men looked at her with surprise. What do you mean? Ezra asked. Margaret took a deep breath, making a decision that scared her more than facing Fletcher or the Holloways. What if there was evidence, real evidence, of what James did to Sarah Miller? Morrison's eyes sharpened. What kind of evidence? Letters, Margaret said. James kept letters from the doctor who took care of Sarah afterward. Letters that prove what happened and when and who paid for it. Where are these letters? Morrison asked. Hidden in the house back in Kansas. I know where James keeps his private papers. Ezra stared at her. You never mentioned letters before. Because I wasn't sure I could get them, Margaret said. But if Sheriff Morrison is taking me back to Kansas anyway. You're talking about breaking into your husband's house, Morrison said slowly. I'm talking about retrieving evidence of a crime, Margaret corrected. Evidence that could save an innocent girl from being blamed for what happened to her. Morrison rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Even if these letters exist, even if we could get them, it doesn't change the fact that you took $500. No, Margaret agreed, but it might change how a judge looks at why I took it. The three of them stood in silence, each weighing the possibilities and risks. Finally, Morrison spoke. It's dangerous, he said. If James or his family caught us. Us? Ezra looked at the sheriff with surprise. Morrison's smile was grim. You think I'm letting Margaret face this alone? Or that I'm trusting the Holloways to play fair once we get to Kansas? You'd help us? Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe it. I'd help the law, Morrison corrected. If there's evidence of a crime, it's my duty to investigate. Ezra was shaking his head. This is madness. There's got to be another way. What other way? Margaret asked. Run again? Keep running for the rest of my life? Let Sarah carry the shame of what James did while he goes free? You could end up in prison, Ezra pointed out. Or worse. I could end up dead if I go back to James without any protection, Margaret replied. At least this way, there's a chance for justice. Morrison folded the warrant and put it back in his pocket. If we're going to do this, we need a plan. And we need to be smart about it. What kind of plan? Ezra asked. The kind that gets us into that house, finds those letters, and gets us all out alive, Morrison said. James Holloway won't be expecting his wife to come back voluntarily. That might give us an advantage. Margaret felt fear and hope warring in her chest. When would we leave? Tonight, Morrison said. We travel fast and quiet, get there before dawn. If we're going to search that house, we need to do it when the family's asleep. And if we get caught? Ezra asked. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. Then we better hope I can talk fast. As the sun began to set over the Nebraska prairie, the three of them made their preparations. Margaret packed light, just the clothes on her back, and the few possessions she'd accumulated during her stay at Ezra's cabin. Ezra loaded his rifle and filled his saddlebags with supplies. Morrison checked his badge and his bullets, making sure both were ready for whatever they might face. You sure about this? Ezra asked Margaret as they prepared to mount their horses. No, Margaret said honestly, but I'm sure I can't keep running forever. And if we find those letters? Then maybe Sarah Miller gets some justice, Margaret said. And maybe I get a chance at a real trial instead of just being handed back to James like a piece of property. As they rode east into the gathering darkness, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. They were riding toward danger, toward people who wanted to hurt her, toward a confrontation that could end badly for all of them. But for the first time since she'd fled Kansas, Margaret felt like she was riding toward something instead of just running away, and that made all the difference. Behind them, the ashes of Ezra's barn grew cold in the Nebraska wind. Ahead lay Kansas, and answers, and a reckoning that was 3 weeks overdue. The stars came out one by one as they rode through the night, lighting their way toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. The house stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows like closed eyes that had seen too much and chosen to look away. Margaret's hands shook as she dismounted in the familiar yard behind the Holloway mansion, every shadow bringing back memories she'd tried to forget. The rose garden where James had first hit her, the back porch where she'd found Sarah crying after her first encounter with the master of the house. You remember where the letters are? Sheriff Morrison whispered, checking his pocket watch in the pale moonlight. James keeps his private papers in a safe behind the painting in his study, Margaret replied, her voice barely audible. Second floor, end of the hall. Ezra studied the imposing 3-story house with its columns and balconies that spoke of old money and older secrets. How do we get in without waking the whole house? Kitchen door, Margaret said. The lock's been broken for months, and James never bothered to fix it. Said the help could come and go as they pleased, since they practically lived here anyway. The words carried bitter memories of Sarah and the other young women who'd worked in this house, trusting their employer to treat them with basic decency. Morrison nodded toward the house. Lead the way, but if anything goes wrong, we run. No heroics, no trying to fight our way out. Agreed? Agreed, Margaret said, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure the others could hear it. They crept across the yard like shadows, avoiding the gravel paths that would crunch underfoot and announce their presence. Margaret's mind filled with memories as they approached the kitchen door, memories of sneaking out this same way during her first escape attempt, when she'd still believed she could simply walk away from her marriage. The door opened with a soft creak that sounded like thunder in the quiet night. Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee, and the lingering fear that seemed to permeate every room of the Holloway house. "Stairs are through there," Margaret whispered, pointing toward a doorway that led to the main part of the house. They moved through rooms that had once been Margaret's prison, past furniture that had been witness to her humiliation and pain. Each step brought back the crushing weight of helplessness she'd felt during her 2 years as James's wife. But now she wasn't alone. Ezra moved beside her with quiet determination, his rifle ready. Sheriff Morrison followed behind, his badge catching occasional glints of moonlight that filtered through the windows. The stairs creaked softly under their weight as they climbed toward the second floor. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as they passed the bedroom she'd once shared with James, its door closed but emanating an aura of threat that made her skin crawl. "Study's at the end," she whispered, pointing down the hallway. They crept forward, passing closed doors behind which the Holloway family slept, unaware that their carefully constructed world was about to be exposed. Margaret wondered if Sarah was sleeping peacefully tonight, or if she still woke with nightmares about what had happened in this house. The study door was unlocked, and they slipped inside like ghosts. Margaret went straight to the painting behind James's desk, a portrait of his grandfather, the family patriarch who'd built the banking empire that gave the Holloways their power. "Behind here," she whispered, lifting the painting aside to reveal a small safe built into the wall. "Do you know the combination?" Morrison asked. Margaret nodded, her fingers trembling as she worked the dial. James had never bothered to hide the combination from her, probably figuring she was too scared and stupid to ever use it against him. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside were stacks of papers, legal documents, and a small wooden box that Margaret remembered seeing before. "Here," she whispered, pulling out a bundle of letters tied with string. "These are from Dr. Henderson. He's the one who treated Sarah after." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Morrison understood. He took the letters and tucked them inside his coat. "Is there anything else?" he whispered. Margaret looked through the remaining papers, searching for anything that might help Sarah's case. Her fingers found a leather journal she'd never seen before, and curiosity made her open it. The pages were filled with James's handwriting, recording dates and amounts and names that made Margaret's blood run cold. It wasn't just Sarah there, were other girls, other payments, other instances of James using his power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. "Dear God," she breathed. "What is it?" Ezra whispered. "He kept records," Margaret said, her voice shaking with horror and hope. "Names, dates, amounts he paid to keep people quiet. It's all here." Morrison reached for the journal, but before he could take it, a voice cut through the darkness like a knife. Well, look what we have here." They spun around to find James standing in the doorway, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls. He was smiling, but his eyes held a coldness that made Margaret's soul freeze. "Hello, darling wife," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "I wondered when you'd come home." Behind him, Margaret could see other figures moving in the hallway, Fletcher and his men, probably roused from their beds in the servants' quarters, where they'd been staying since the family's return from Nebraska. "James," Margaret said, clutching the journal to her chest, "we're not here to cause trouble. Aren't you?" James stepped into the room, and Margaret could see the familiar signs of barely controlled rage in his face. "Breaking into my house? Stealing from my safe? What would you call it?" "We'd call it gathering evidence of criminal activity," Sheriff Morrison said, stepping protectively in front of Margaret. James's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Evidence? Of what?" "Of what you did to Sarah Miller," Margaret said, finding her voice. "And all the others." The smile vanished from James's face. I don't know what lies you've been telling these men, but they're not lies, Margaret interrupted, holding up the journal. It's all here, in your own handwriting. Every girl you hurt, every family you paid to stay quiet. James's mask of civility finally cracked completely. Give me that journal, Margaret, now. No. The word hung in the air between them, charged with 2 years of suppressed rage and newfound courage. Margaret had said no to her husband, probably for the first time in their marriage. You will give me that journal, James repeated, his voice taking on the dangerous tone she remembered so well. And then, you will come home where you belong. She's not going anywhere with you, Ezra said, raising his rifle. James looked at him with contempt. The simple rancher thinks he can protect my wife? How touching. She's not your wife anymore, Morrison said firmly. She's my prisoner, being transported to face legal charges. That makes her my responsibility. Your responsibility? James's voice rose with indignation. She's my property. She's a human being, Ezra said quietly, and human beings aren't property. The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence, with Fletcher and his men filling the doorway behind James, guns drawn but not yet aimed. Margaret clutched the journal tighter, knowing it held the key to justice for Sarah and all the others. James, she said, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it, it's over. The truth is going to come out. The truth, James spat, is that you're a thief and a runaway wife who's going to be punished for her crimes. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But first, everyone's going to know what kind of man you really are. James lunged forward, reaching for the journal, but Ezra was faster. The rifle butt caught James in the stomach, doubling him over with a grunt of pain and surprise. Time to go, Morrison said urgently. They pushed past James and his men, racing for the stairs as shouts erupted behind them. Margaret clutched the journal and letters to her chest as they ran through the house that had been her prison, finally carrying proof that might set her and Sarah free. Behind them, James's voice rose in a howl of rage that followed them into the darkness. You can't run forever, Margaret. I'll find you. You belong to me. But as they reached their horses and galloped away into the dawn, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The truth was finally going to have its day in court. And for the first time since leaving Kansas, Margaret wasn't running away from something, she was running toward justice. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of gold and promise as they rode toward a future that finally held possibilities instead of just more fear. Behind them, the Holloway house grew smaller in the distance, its power broken by the truth carried in a leather journal and a bundle of letters that would change everything.